Welcome to our Teams IT Pro Academy training. This is a multi-part series on direct routing. In this lesson, we'll be talking about migrating to direct routing with Microsoft Teams. In addition to this training, you can find other IT Pro Academy trainings at our aka.ms/Teams Academy link. If you have feedback that you'd like to provide on this session, you can see the links and instructions noted on the slide here. If you have feedback on the product itself, make sure that you follow our aka.ms/Teams feedback link. You can see at the bottom of the slide the current version of this presentation. Now, some of the key learnings that we're going to cover in this session. Direct routing allows you to connect your existing phone infrastructure to the Microsoft Teams service. Direct routing itself will require a certified session border controller. Now, we'll cover what those are as we go throughout the presentation. We will also cover the configuration for direct routing in detail during the session, but we do also have it clearly documented on our docs portal. Let's take a look at the full agenda for the multi-part training on direct routing. The first lesson will cover what is direct routing, when to use it, and how to properly plan for direct routing. The second lesson will cover configuring direct routing and managing direct routing. And the third lesson will cover migrating to direct routing. The lesson that you're currently taking is highlighted on this slide. Let's dig into our lesson on migrating to direct routing. As we look at migration to direct routing, we first want to level set with some migration concepts. First and foremost, we want to make sure that we consider what the source of the migration is going to be. Meaning, are we migrating to Teams direct routing from a legacy PBX system like a Cisco Call Manager or some other third-party PBX platform? Or are we migrating from an environment such as a Skype for Business server platform that could be using enterprise voice? The reason that's important is because based on the source of the migration, we may have a slightly different set of steps that we need to adapt to. The second piece that's going to be critical in this conceptual discussion is the placement of our session border controllers in our topology, and we'll cover this in greater detail. If you're not familiar again with the concept of the session border controller, make sure that you've gone back and watched the first lesson that we did for planning with direct routing. We then also have to make sure that we understand how to prepare for the cutover, because the cutover to Teams with direct routing involves not only enabling the user for Teams and the various features of Teams like phone system and direct routing, but we also need to make some reconfiguration changes to the inbound routing of the particular phone number to ensure that it's now no longer being passed over to the old PBX or the old Skype for Business environment, but over to the new Teams environment. We'll cover each of these concepts as we go throughout this lesson. So let's start by taking a look at a topology that we have here. When I look at the topology for direct routing migration, first and foremost, we need to start with some type of connectivity to the PSTN. So you can see on the left-hand side here, I have a telco provided connection. This could again be a SIP trunk from your carrier. It could be a PRI line like a T1 or an E1. But generally you have some kind of telco provided connection on the left. And then on the right-hand side, you could be bringing this into Skype for Business server, like we see here, represented by our mediation server. You could be bringing this into a legacy or a third-party PBX, like a Cisco or an Avaya platform. And then, of course, we have our final destination up here, which is the direct routing environment. Now, when I look at this overall topology, the key piece to all of this is right here, the session border controller. The reason this is key is the session border controller will take care of the routing logic for us to be able to know, hey, when a phone call comes in to this particular phone number, where should I send it? Is this user still on the legacy PBX or have they been migrated to Teams? All of that logic is built inside of the session border controller. That's why we recommend to place the session border controller at what we call the quote front of the line. What we mean by front of the line is it is right in line with the connection that comes in from the PSTN. So the carrier connection comes directly to the SBC, and now the SBC can see all of the possible places to route the call. Should I send it to the legacy PBX, to the Skype for Business environment, or to Teams? The SBC, being at the front of the line, has that capability of being able to make that decision. This helps to simplify the routing logic because it is anchored on that SBC, and it gives us some more creative options that we could use, such as directory-based lookups, which I'm going to cover a little bit later in this training. Let's take a walk through a migration from Skype for Business server with Enterprise Voice to Teams direct routing using a number of the concepts that we've talked about earlier. So let's set up the scenario. In our scenario here, we have our connection from the PSTN, which in this case is a telco provided SIP trunk that we've acquired. This connection is currently coming into an existing session border controller, and the session border controller is configured with a SIP trunk that routes these calls into our Skype for Business server environment. So you see we've got our mediation server and we have our enterprise pool. And on the right, I have two users. I have Alice and I have Bob. And you can see respective phone numbers for Alice and Bob. The Skype for Business server environment is deployed on premises, and these users, Alice and Bob, are using enterprise voice feature sets. When these particular phone numbers that you see here and here, these are, of course, North American numbering plan phone numbers indicated by the +1, they are actually provided by this telco SIP trunk. This is where we want to be able to get to direct routing. So of course, I need to be able to establish this connection, which we talked about in our previous two lessons, right? How to plan and how to configure direct routing. So we're going to take this particular discussion as if we've already set up the foundational pieces, or the plumbing, as we call it, of direct routing. And now let's figure out what are our next steps going to be to actually migrate these users, Alice and Bob, from our Skype for Business environment over to Teams. Now, as a starting point, there's a couple of prerequisites that need to be met before we can actually do the migration itself. First and foremost, we have to synchronize our on-premises users to Azure Active Directory. So you can see the AKA MS link that we have on the slide at the top talks about how to set up the synchronization between your on-premises Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. Make sure as you read through that documentation that you pay close attention to the proper attributes that you need to sync. From a Skype standpoint, these are attributes that start with MS-RTC SIP. These are critical attributes that need to be synchronized into the service so that the service can properly understand where your users are in your environment, and do you even have an on-premises Skype for Business deployment. The second piece that we need to have configured is what we call split domain, or often referred to as hybrid. You can see on the slide in the middle, the second AKA MS link that we have that will take you to our guidance and documentation on how to configure split domain. Now, this is necessary for us to be able to move the user from the on-premises Skype for Business environment directly into the Teams environment. And if we don't have hybrid configured, we're not going to be able to run the proper commandlets or use the proper admin tools to be able to do this. And third piece, when we look at our starting point, is the tenant coexistence mode must not be set to Teams only. Right? If we still have on-premises users using Skype for Business server, we can't set the tenant to Teams only mode yet because the on-prem users aren't there, right? They're still in the on-premises world. We recommend this generally to be islands, but if you need some more detail on the tenant coexistence modes, check out the link at the bottom of this slide that will take you through our upgrade workshops. We have a series of ongoing upgrade workshops that you can go to learn more about how you plan and implement your paths to Teams. Okay, now we're going to talk about how we stage the migration. Now you might be thinking, staging the migration, what are you talking about? What would I need to stage? There's actually a series of steps that you can and should perform well ahead of the actual date that you're going to migrate the user and their phone numbers from the existing Skype for Business environment to Teams. And those steps are outlined here. Now I'm going to cover these in a little bit more detail as we go, but essentially, to summarize staging, we want to make sure that we've applied the appropriate licenses to the user, granted their appropriate voice routing policies for the direct routing environment. If applicable, we've granted them their associated dial plan that they may need to use. We have verified or gone ahead and enabled them for hosted voicemail. And we've prepared our user communications, our adoption change management strategy for these users. All of these items can be completed and should be completed in advance of the actual user migration. This ensures that we've given enough time in the service for these particular items to take effect, for provisioning to do its thing, and it allows for a much smoother transition when it comes to the actual day of migration. So our first part of staging is to ensure that we properly license the user. As we show at the top here, these are the required licenses that we have for a user in Teams that wants to use direct routing. Phone system, Teams, plus the Skype for Business Plan 2 license, if that is included with the particular SKU that you're using, and the audio conferencing license as desired. If you need more detail on the license assignments and which components are required versus optional, go back and check out the plan direct routing session for more details there. Now, the licenses that you see at the top, of course, could be part of an enterprise service plan. For example, E1, E3, E5, and so forth. That's an enterprise service plan or an eSKU. And the location that we assign to the user is also critically important. So if you look at my screenshots here, these are taken from the URL that you see at the bottom here. This is our main admin interface for Office 365. If I go into a user, like my user here, Deborah, and I pivot to the Licenses and Apps tab, you can see that I can select a location for this user. This location is important because, number one, it's going to define what assigned service country dial plan we give to this user. So Deborah here is assigned the United Kingdom, so she's going to get a service country dial plan for the United Kingdom. Underneath here, you can also see where we can assign licenses and select our various eSKUs. Now, in addition to assigning the license and setting this location, which also, by the way, this location needs to be where the user physically resides. Okay, this can't be a user that physically lives in the US that you've just picked UK because they wanted a UK number. That's against the terms of service. You have to ensure that the location information matches where the user physically resides. And that's also for emergency services reasoning. But make sure we've got our right location, make sure we have our correct license assigned. And then if you actually scroll down a little further, you can expand out all of the various apps that go along with your eSKU, in this case, with your enterprise service plan. And you can see with the screenshot on the right, I've assigned audio conferencing, phone system, Teams, and because Skype Online Plan 2 is part of this SKU, I need to make sure that this is also assigned as well. I know you might be thinking, I'm not using Skype Online. I'm just simply using Teams. Why do I even need this? Trust me, you need this. Make sure that this option, if it is included as part of the plan or part of the eSKU, that you ensure that this is selected. Now, we have some PowerShell commandlets that we can run that can check and verify the state of our user provisioning. Right? When we assign these licenses to the users, we have to make sure that they're properly provisioned in the service so that the service knows what features and capabilities they have available to them. So you can see in this screenshot, if I run this get CS online user commandlet, there's a couple of key attributes that I want to be able to take a look at. First off, we have an attribute here called on-prem hosting provider. This lets us know and lets the service know where this particular account is homed or where this account lives. And right now, this account lives on Skype for Business server on premises. And I know that because the value here is SRV:, right? That indicates that the user is hosted in Skype on premises. The second attribute we want to look at is interpreted user type. Right? This lets the service know a little bit more about the user and whether or not the user is in a state of provisioning or not. Now, the very first time you assign a license, or any time I should say, you assign a license to the user, if you come out and run this commandlet, you'll probably catch it in flight as it's doing the provisioning. That's where you'll see interpreted user type change to what you see here. Hybrid on-prem, SFB user, needs provisioning. So that's telling the service, hey, there was a new license assigned, and now we need to go provision all of the features and functions and capabilities of that license that was just assigned to them. This will run, and when the provisioning process is complete, this will return back to, as you see here, interpreted user type, hybrid on-prem, SFB user. So now we know that the user is configured as part of hybrid, right? Hybrid, meaning they're synchronized with Azure AD. On-prem, SFB user, meaning the user account is homed on premises and is homed in the Skype for Business environment. Now, the next thing we can do as part of staging is to enable the user itself. Now, by virtue of assigning the various licenses, many of these features will automatically get turned on for you, one of which should be enterprise voice enabled and hosted voicemail. Sometimes I have seen hosted voicemail not get set automatically upon assigning the license. No worries. We have a commandlet here that we can go ahead and run. Set CS user, the identity of the user, and then hosted voicemail true. Also at this time, from a user config perspective, we can go ahead and grant the voice routing policy to the user and optionally the dial plan to the user using the commandlets that you see here. Now again, for more detail on those commandlets, you can look at our previous sessions we did on planning and configuring and managing direct routing. At the end, when I do a quick get CS online user, I can see right up at the top here, boom, on-prem enterprise voice enabled is true. Makes sense because they are enabled in Skype on-prem and they're doing enterprise voice on-prem, so that should be true. My hosted voicemail and enterprise voice enabled are both true, right? So all three of these options should be true. Here's my online voice routing policy that I have assigned to this particular user as part of the grant CS online voice routing policy commandlet. You can see here that the line URIs are set, right? This on-prem line URI, this is the phone number that's assigned to the user in Skype for Business server, right? That got replicated up via Azure AD Sync. That shows up not only here in on-prem line URI, but we also then copy that into this line URI attribute as well. And then finally, you see here my dial plans, right? This dial plan option that you see first, that's the service country dial plan, right? That's the one that gets assigned based on the location that you picked in the dropdown when you assign the user that particular license. And then there's tenant dial plan here. This only shows up if you've actually granted a dial plan to the individual user. So in this particular example, I granted a dial plan called US-CA-Irvine to this individual user. Now remember, from a user standpoint, their effective dial plan is going to be a culmination of both of these, right? And again, for more detail on that, go check out the second session that we did on configuring and managing direct routing. It is important to emphasize here, again, all of the steps that we've talked about up to this point from a staging standpoint, they're not disruptive to the user. The user isn't going to notice anything different, right? The behavior won't change in their Skype for Business client, nor will their behavior change in their Teams client. They're not going to see a dial pad. They're not going to receive inbound phone calls. They're not going to be able to make outbound PSTN phone calls. So these are items that you can do well ahead of the actual migration. Generally, you should do them at least maybe 5 days or so ahead of the actual migration, just to give it time to settle in the service so that when we do actually do the upgrade or the cutover from Skype for Business to Teams with direct routing, we can have a minimal delay in service for the user. Now, we've done all of the staging. Of course, we can't forget about this is now the time to make sure we've got the right readiness plan and our adoption change management is in full swing. Now, of course, this is outside of the scope of this particular lesson to talk about all the aspects of adoption change management. But if you take a look at the two aka.ms links that I have on this slide, the first one takes you to our upgrade success kit, which has a whole suite of tools that you can use, posters, email templates, things of that nature that you can use for communications. And then we also have our upgrade workshops, which are actually live on-demand trainings that Microsoft will perform that you can use to help gauge and understand how to build your appropriate adoption and change management strategy. Critically important that you get your readiness plan, you get your comms going so that your users are well aware of when this change is happening and what to expect. And now it's migration day. It's time to actually move the user from Skype for Business on-prem with enterprise voice to Teams and direct routing. On migration day, there's really only two specific items that we need to make sure that we account for. One, we have to now redirect the user's inbound phone number from a routing perspective to go from the source environment, which in this case is Skype for Business, to the destination environment, which is now Teams. This generally involves changing the routing rules on your session border controller to make sure that you route the number into Teams. Now, again, this makes sense when you have the session border controller at the front of the line, right? Because the connection will come in from the PSTN, from the telco provider, and hits the session border controller first. And now the session border controller can make an intelligent routing decision. And it can say, all right, Bob, Well, he's currently on Skype for Business, so I'm going to route that particular call over to Skype for Business. Migration day comes, I go into the session border controller and I change the configuration to say, hey, session border controller, when you see a call come in for this phone number, 555-2832, instead of routing it over the SIP trunk to Skype for Business, I would now like you to route it over the SIP trunk to Teams. That's the inbound routing change that we need to make. Now, of course, you can do this by select telephone numbers, right? One by one. That's great for piloting and testing, right? You can do it by all numbers, right? If we're migrating everybody at a particular location all at once, we can just simply update the trunk to say, hey, all calls that come in, instead of sending all calls to Skype, send all calls to Teams. That's kind of a full cutover approach if you're doing an entire site, right? Or if you have maybe you have a rather large site and you're doing chunks of users at a time, right? Well, that may not be great to do by telephone number because a lot of times the phone numbers aren't in blocks, they're not in sequence. So we might have an opportunity to do that dynamically using what are called dynamic Active Directory lookups. I'm going to cover that in the next section. But essentially, this first task is all about redirecting the inbound phone number for the user. Now, additionally, as we're making changes on the SBC for routing, we actually have to move the user into Teams. And that's accomplished by using the commandlet that you see on the slide here. Move-CS user with the -move to Teams parameter. Now that move to Teams parameter is only available in server 2019 or server 2015 CU8 and higher. So you need to make sure that you have, at the very least, an administrative workstation that has these versions of the administrative tools on it, if not actually having your servers upgraded to these particular versions. So you can see here, I run this move CS user commandlet. I have an identity of who I'm going to move. My target is sipfed.online.link.com. That basically means I want to move this account into the service. And this move to Teams parameter is going to actually move the user straight to Microsoft Teams. Now, when we do the user move, we're also going to do some license checks for you. Now, remember, as part of the staging, we wanted to make sure that we assigned the proper licenses to users. Well, we're also going to do some licensing checks when you go to move the user. Specifically, we're going to check two things: audio conferencing and enterprise voice. If the user is enabled for a particular service in on-premises, we want to ensure they have that same experience when they go online. Let's take this first example I have in my screenshot. My user that is on premises, I have enabled for both enterprise voice, so they have PSTN calling in and out, but I've also enabled them for audio conferencing. But when I went and I assigned the licenses as part of my staging, look on the right side here, I gave them an E5 license, but I didn't check the box for audio conferencing because they said that was optional. Maybe I just decided they didn't need it. Well, if I run the move CS user commandlet, I'm actually going to be greeted with the error message that you see here, which indicates that, hey, this user is enabled for dial-in conferencing on-prem, but they're not enabled for it online. That's going to result in a loss of service for them. So we're going to prevent that and allow you as the administrator to make the corrective action. Well, there's two ways you can correct it. One, you can just simply come over here and give them the license, right? But maybe you don't want them to have this license. Cool. You can use this -bypass audio conferencing check parameter that basically says, go ahead and move the user, but don't bother checking to see if they have a license or not. Just go ahead and move the user. The same would be true if you were dealing with enterprise voice, right? Maybe they're enabled for enterprise voice on premises, but you're moving them into Teams and you're not going to enable them for enterprise voice for whatever reason. Obviously, in the context of what we're talking about in this lesson, this is about migrating voice to Teams. So hopefully you're not going to use the bypass enterprise voice check. Hopefully they are actually going to be, licensed properly for phone system and so forth. Now, as we run the move CS user commandlet, which by the way, if you didn't gather from those screenshots, that is run in the Skype for Business server management shell, right? The on-premises management shell. We can now verify where we are in that move by using commandlets against the service. Again, it's the get CS online user commandlet. Take a look here, my screenshot on the left. You can see I have an interpreted user type of, in this case, it's hybrid online SFB user needs provisioning. Now, a couple things to unpack from that. First, if your memory isn't all that good, I jotted it down here for you. Before we moved to this user, it used to be hybrid on-prem SFB user. Now it's hybrid online SFB user. That lets me know that this particular user account has been moved online. That was the result of my move CS user command, right? I do have that needs provisioning tag at the end because this user is now moved into the service. We need to run the provisioning cycle on them again to make sure that we've got the correct, services enabled for this particular user. So if I wait a few minutes or so, let provisioning do its thing, I run this commandlet again. Notice now this interpreted user type is simply hybrid online SFB user. So the user account has been moved online. And if I look down at the bottom, that move to Teams option sets the upgrade effective mode for this account to Teams only. That's what I mean when I say we're going to take the account from on-premises Skype for Business straight to Teams. It's straight to Teams because we've automatically set them to Teams only mode. We've moved their meetings, all that good stuff by default. They are now Teams only with enterprise voice, with direct routing configured. Now, the last piece of the puzzle is to make sure that we verify that outbound dialing works from the Teams client. Because remember, as an admin, we've done two things. We've reconfigured the SBC, that's for the inbound calls, and we've moved the user and enabled them for Teams direct routing. Now we need to make sure the user can properly dial out from the Teams client. We do this by ensuring that in the Teams application, we go to the Calls app, which you see here, and we see that they have a dial pad available to them. This ensures that the user can now make an outbound PSTN phone call. Now, some requirements to make sure that the dial pad shows up. Well, of course, we have licensing requirements, right, which we talked about before. The user needs to be homed online. So if you were to look at the hosting provider value, remember before we said when they were on-prem, it was SRV:. Well, when they're online, that changes to sipfed.online.link.com, right? Same thing that you put in the commandlet, the move CS user commandlet, right? Of course, again, license. They need to have, well, they could have a calling plan assigned to them. Remember, it is possible to do a user with both calling plan and direct routing. But for the purposes of what we're talking about here, this user would be following the OR path of having an online voice routing policy assigned to them. Remember, you did that as part of staging, right? You, of course, need to make sure that allow private calling is enabled in the Teams calling policy, CS Teams calling policy. So don't disable calling. That would be silly. And they have to be running a supported client. Right, supported clients include our desktop clients, that's PC and Mac, our mobile clients, the new Edge browser, the Chrome browser. Right? All of those have capabilities of being able to do the calling features inside of the Teams app itself. Now, this may take a little bit of time for the dial pad to show up. Most often in my experience, having the user do a quick sign out and sign in of the Teams application is the fastest way to get the dial pad to show up. If it's not showing up, even after a sign out and sign in, there's a quick check that you can do to see what the service is sending to the client. And we can do that by looking at the Teams diagnostic logs, or what we call the web logs, right? If you're in your PC client, when you have the Teams application in focus, you can just do Control-Alt-Shift-1, and that will dump the diagnostic logs into your downloads folder. On a Mac, that would be Command-Option-Shift-1. That'll same thing, dump those client logs into your downloads folder. Now, when I look in these logs, I'm going to search for a couple of things. I'm going to search for this calling support service entry. Specifically, you're going to see a lot of these, but you want the one that talks about calculated is PSTN calling allowed? Because this is the blurb inside of the log that's going to tell us what the service thinks you should be entitled for. And this is where we can cross-reference to see if some of these don't look right, then the Teams client isn't going to display the dial pad. Key things for us to look at here, right? There's a bunch of parameters in here, but the ones that we're really keen on is, of course, we want to make sure this is calling aloud true, right? That's this allow private calling piece, right? Make sure the calling is allowed, right? Is EV enabled, right? They need to be enabled for enterprise voice. That should have been done as part of staging, right? But now we have these fun ones. Is business voice path, right? Business voice path, if that's true, that means they have a calling plan assigned to them. In the case of this particular user that I was testing with, this user did not have a calling plan. So is business voice path is false. Is BYOT enabled is true. That means that they are enabled for direct routing. And that's been picked up by the fact that I have a CS online voice routing policy assigned to this particular user. So essentially, one or both of these parameters have to be true for this dial pad to light up. If neither one of these parameters are true, you're not going to see the dial pad in the Teams client. One of the more advanced items that we can do as part of this migration is what we call SBC dynamic or conditional routing. Let's talk a little bit about what that is in this particular section. Dynamic routing on the session border controller is sometimes known as a directory-based lookup. And it's the ability for us to do conditional routing based on an LDAP query that we do into the local Active Directory. And this allows us to make routing decisions based on some dynamic rules. And in plain English, those dynamic rules could be, well, if the user is on premises, send the call to Skype for Business Server. But if the user is online, send the call to Teams, right? Those are some very simplistic routing decisions that we can build with dynamic routing. Now, the advantage to this is now you don't have to change the routing mechanism by individual telephone number, right? Which can get quite tedious if you're trying to do that line by line by line inside of the session border controller, unless you're lucky enough to have the numbers in a block, but that just generally never happens. So by being able to do dynamic routing, it gives us a much more flexible way of being able to key off of a particular attribute and then make a routing decision based on the output or the result of that particular query. So I wanted to bring you back to a visual of what the directory lookup flow would look like. So in this particular example, again, like we've seen before, I start with my telco connection. I've got some kind of telco provided connection, whether it's a SIP trunk, PRI, what have you, right? That's coming in from my carrier and it hits my session border controller. Now, in this particular example, the session border controller is configured with a trunk to the Skype for Business world, and it's also configured with direct routing, as you can see here, right? So the session border controller knows that it has two different paths that it can send the calls that come in. How does it make the decision without, an administrator having to go manually configure these things? Well, that's where LDAP comes in. So here, I establish an LDAP connection to a domain controller, and there's a set of attributes that I can query, a couple of which are critical attributes, right? The MSRTC SIP line, the deployment locator, and then optionally we have options flags and extension attributes that we could use. So what do all these attributes do? What's the point of them? Well, the MSRTC SIP line attribute, this is what I call the anchor attribute, right? It's used to match with an incoming call. So when an inbound call reaches the session border controller, right? This could be a call that was coming in for Bob, the 949-555 number. That reaches the session border controller. And the first thing that the session border controller can do is go, oh, I have a call for this particular phone number. Let me go look in Active Directory and see if there's a user in Active Directory that has this phone number, which there should be, right? Because Bob is already enabled for enterprise voice. So I call it the anchor attribute because that's the first thing we want to key off of is the phone number that's come in to the SBC. Does that even exist? Because maybe it's a phone number that's not assigned to a user. Well, then we can reject it, right? But if it is a phone number that's assigned to the user, I want to match it to that user. So I'm going to do that by looking at the MSRTC SIP line attribute because that's where the user's phone number is stored when they're enabled for enterprise voice in Skype for Business Server. So great, I anchor on that and now I find Bob. Well, now the next thing I want to do as part of my query is I want to look at this attribute. Tell me what's in MSRTC SIP-deployment locator. because if I see SRV colon in that particular item, I'm going to send it to Skype. But if I see sipfed.online.link.com, I'm going to send it to Teams, right? So again, going by flow, I do these queries, I return, ooh, Bob has sipfed.online.link.com. Cool, boom, send that call up to Teams. Maybe the next call that comes in is the 949-555-1001. That's Alice, right? Maybe I haven't migrated Alice yet. So again, that call comes in, we do our LDAP query, I anchor it and match it to Alice, and now I say, let me look at Alice's account, and let me see what Alice's account has for deployment locator. Oh, Alice's account has SRV. Cool. Send that call over to Skype for Business. Boom. Now I don't even have to touch the SBC to make these routing changes. All I have to do is do the move CS user, right? Because the move CS user is going to change that deployment locator option for me, and pow, the SBC can now properly route the call up to Teams because I've moved the user to Teams. Pretty slick, right? Now there are a couple of optional items that you have here, right? You can use the options flag as a way to kind of do a safety check, right? Because maybe the user has a phone number assigned, but they're not actually enabled for enterprise voice for whatever reason, right? We've seen that before in the Skype for Business days when we had to deal with, getting to the dial-in conferencing page and being able to sign into conferencing with your, PIN and all that kind of fun stuff. So you might have a situation where the user is enabled with a line URI, but they're not actually enabled for enterprise voice. So you could do another quick check, look at options flag, and see if it has a value of at least 385, right? Because that lets me know that the user is enabled for enterprise voice. And optionally, if you have Exchange on-prem deployed, or you've at least prepped, the schema and Active Directory for Exchange in on-prem, you might also have these extension attributes, right? Extension attribute 1 to extension attribute 15. I've had some customers that use this as another way to help flag if a user has been, placed in Skype Online or Teams or what have you. So for example, they might use extension attribute 1, and when the user's migrated to Teams, they just put the word Teams in that extension attribute. And that way, when I do my LDAP query, I look at that value, and if I see Teams, I route it to Teams. If I see nothing, I route it to Skype, for example. Now, you might wonder, why would I need that? Well, think about the scenario I've given you up to this point. We only have two choices, Skype on premises and Teams, right? But some organizations are in the midst of their transition. So they have Skype on premises, they have Skype online, and they have Teams. Well, the deployment locator value for the Skype Online user and the Teams user is going to be the same, sipfed.online.link.com. So the extension attribute could help flag a differentiation between Skype Online and Teams, for example. Okay, so we've talked about the logical aspect of the dynamic routing. Now let's cover at a high level what the configuration of that looks like. Now I'm going to cover this at a high level because the configuration is specific to each of the respective SBC vendors. So the way you configure this on an audio codes is different from how you configure it on Sonus and so on and so forth. But at a high level, it's all pretty much the same, right? We configure LDAP first, right? So we go into the SBC and we turn on the LDAP function. Oftentimes this is disabled by default. We turn on the LDAP function, and we then configure a connection to the local directory. This is done often by, for example, on audio codes, we configure an LDAP server group, and inside of that server group, I can configure an LDAP server. This tells me what the name of the domain controller is, what base context I'm going to use, the base DN, and so on and so forth. It basically tells us how to connect via LDAP to your domain controller. The next step is to build the rules to query the respective attributes that we want out of Active Directory, right? This is where we start building the logic, right? Hey, if the user is on-prem, send it to Skype. If the user is online, send them to Teams. These are the rules that we're going to query here. Now, in the audio codes world, we call these call setup rules. I'll give you a sample here of what that looks like on the screenshot on the left. I've built this call setup rule. The rule set ID is an arbitrary number in this case, but it's important, right? What you pick here. I picked 1, great. It's an LDAP request. My target, that's my domain controller group that I configured to actually talk to the environment. The request key, right? This is my anchor, right? This is what I want to go and match to find the correct object in Active Directory. So you think about that, the phone number that comes in for, Alice, she's +1 949 555 1001. When that phone number comes in, I need to go look that phone number up in the line URI attribute in Active Directory, see if I can find a match. And if I find a match, boom, that's Alice. Cool. Well, that's my request key here, right? I need to make sure that the line URI matches that phone number that came into the SBC. Once I find the match of that object, well, then I want to get an attribute. I want to know what's the value of deployment locator, right? Because if the value of deployment locator is SRV, then I want you to send it to Skype. But if it's sipfed.online.link.com, well, then I want you to send it to Teams, right? And there's my condition. That attribute, I want it to be equal to sipfed.online.link.com. Now, on the routing itself, the call that comes in from my PSTN provider, which you can see here, this is my source group, that's the PSTN trunk. This is my destination, which is Teams, but I now tell it, what's the call setup rule ID? Well, it's rule ID number 1, which is the rule that I created here. That's basically telling the SBC, hey, before you route this call, go look at the call setup rule. And if the condition matches, then we'll go ahead and route it to the destination that's on this particular IP to IP routing rule. If it doesn't, well, then we'll go on to the next rule that we match, which would be my Skype for Business rule. Now, optionally, you can also configure the SBC to cache some of these attributes as well. So if you're constantly querying for attributes like MSRTC zip line or MSRTC zip deployment locator and so forth, this is an option for you to have those values cached so that you don't impact the performance of having to query the local domain controllers all the time. Many of the SBCs have an option to allow you to cache certain AD attributes and values, and that can then help reduce the load on your local domain controllers. Now let's look at some additional considerations and next steps with regards to migrating to direct routing from on-premises Skype for Business. Now we also need to take a look at some additional voice components as part of the overall migration from on-prem Skype for Business to Teams, especially with enterprise voice. So when we look at the first area, delegation, call forwarding, team calls, these are items that are going to need to be reconfigured in Teams after you've made the migration to Teams only mode. When you look at enterprise voice delegation, make sure that the delegator and the delegate migrate at the same time. You don't want to try to deal with a delegate that's in Teams only mode and a delegator that's not, right? From an auto attendance perspective, if you're still running full on-premises auto attendance, you'll want to get them migrated into cloud-based auto attendance. And there's an AKMS link here that'll tell you a little bit more about the cloud-based auto attendance. Response groups. There's no automated way that we're going to move response groups into Teams call queues. So you're going to need to recreate these as call queues. Take a look at the AKMS link that I've placed in the middle of the slide for call queues. That'll take you through the steps on how to set up and manage and plan for those various call queues. Now, the service numbers that we use with the call queues and with the resource accounts that we use with call queues, they can be applied through direct routing. So you can bring the phone number in and assign it to a resource account that is used with a call queue and bring that in through direct routing. One area to note though, in on-prem Skype for Business, we have this concept of an RBAC role for a response group administrator. We don't have an equivalent to that currently in Teams today, so just keep that in mind. If you're leveraging common area phones, you can have those common area phones reconfigured in Teams. Just follow the link that you see on the slide here. Same thing with analog devices, right? The analog devices that are currently configured in Skype for Business today, you could reconfigure that to work in the Teams environment. Just beware, and there's a link here for how to handle analog devices. It's not the same approach that we had in the Skype for Business world, right? When you configure analog devices connected to direct routing in Teams, all of that routing logic and configuration is really handled through the SBCs themselves. Analog phones that are connected to Teams in this way aren't searchable from Teams. So you're not going to have a contact object that represents this, be able to find it and click to call it currently. So if a user wants to call the analog device, they're going to have to manually enter the phone number that's associated with that analog device to be able to call it. And lastly, there's a couple of features that as of this recording, we currently don't support in Teams, vacant number announcements and private lines. So just be aware of those as you're staging the rest of your migration from on-premises. Another piece that I wanted to talk through is how do we handle new users during the migration period? If you're lucky enough to migrate your entire org all at once, then this is probably not something you need to deal with, but a lot of medium and larger size organizations are staging this migration. They're doing batches of users at a time. Well, while we're migrating these batches of users, we might be getting some new hires in. So how do we handle these new users during our migration? Well, effectively, we have two ways to approach this. One, we can create them in on-premises Skype for Business and then move them to Teams, right? Basically copying the exact same process we've been doing. Or option two is we can create them net new within Teams itself. So let's break these two options down a little bit further. With option one, this is effectively the same way that you were doing it prior to starting your migration, right? You create the user account in the on-premises Active Directory, you enable the user in Skype for Business Server, you enable them for enterprise voice in Skype for Business Server, give them a phone number. Of course, everything syncs up into Azure AD using your Azure AD Sync components, and then you migrate the user to Teams, as we talked about earlier in this session. You can continue that same process with net new users, right? Just basically build them in Skype and migrate them to Teams. Option two would allow for us to create the user directly within Teams. Now, the advantage to creating it in Teams is you're setting yourself up for the forward looking of once we do get rid of the Skype for Business world, I'll be able to manage this account directly within Teams from that point forward. So the process looks like this. We go and create the user account as normal, say in your on-premises Active Directory, right? Maybe you have an HR application that's kind of kicked off and builds this user account in on-prem AD. Cool. The user gets synced into Azure Active Directory as usual, and then you license the user like we had talked about before with our planning and config steps. At this point, we want to ensure that the user is Teams only. This could be at the tenant mode, but more likely because we're in the process of doing this migration, we still have on-prem users, so it's likely not at the tenant level. It's something that you would make sure that you've assigned directly to the user to ensure that this user is now in Teams only mode. And now we need to go to the on-premises Skype for Business server management shell and run a couple of commands that will basically create a representation of this Teams user in the on-premises Skype for Business environment. You might be wondering, why do I even need to do that? Well, again, based on the timing of all of this, you may still be in the process of doing the migration, and you have a bunch of users that are still potentially using the on-premises Skype for Business server and clients. Well, if they want to be able to contact these new users, they need to know about them. Well, if they're only created in Teams, the on-prem Skype environment isn't going to know that they're there. So we need to run these sets of commandlets to create a representation of that user in the on-prem Skype environment, as well as create a representation of their phone number. That way, in case they dial them by number, we can do a proper reverse number lookup, match it to the user, and send the call to Teams. Those commandlets look like this. You can see the first commandlet that I run. Grab my little mouse pointer here. First commandlet that I run here is the enable CS user commandlet. Right? This is the user that I created, their SIP address, and then the -hosting provider proxy FQDN is set to sipfed.online.link.com. That creates a representation of this user in the on-premises Skype for Business world, but basically tells the on-prem Skype world, hey, by the way, this user is in the service, right? So they exist, just you don't own them. They exist in the service. Cool. Then my next commandlet I ran is set CS user for this user, enterprise voice enabled true, and then line URI tel : plus blah, and I gave them their phone number. Right? The end result of that is this user gets created as a representation of the online user in the Skype for Business server environment. You can see that it's notated here what their hosting provider is. So yep, they're online. They do have a phone number and they are enterprise voice enabled. This way, anybody, again, that's left behind in the Skype for Business server on-prem world, they could actually dial this user by their phone number and we would know about it, match it via reverse number lookup, and send it to their Teams client. Once we've done this, we just complete and verify our direct routing configuration in the service, assign our online voice routing policy, and off we go. Okay, so at this point, I've migrated all of my users. I've taken care of whether I'm going to do option one, option two. Now what? My migration's done. What do I do? Well, the next steps are to disable hybrid and effectively decommission the on-prem environment. So as part of the disabling of hybrid or split domain, there's a few things that we want to make sure that we accomplish. First and foremost, we need to make sure that we update our DNS entries appropriately to point to the Office 365 service and not the on-prem edge pool. This includes various SRV and CNAME records, and you can see an example of that in the screenshot on the right side of the slide. You'll also want to disable split domain in the tenant. So this is a commandlet that you'll run in the Skype for Business Online PowerShell that you can see on the slide here of set CS tenant federation configuration. And then finally, you want to disable the ability in on-prem to communicate with Office 365, right? That opposite direction. And that's basically turning off the hosted provider. So you get the output of get CS hosting provider, pipe it to set CS hosting provider, and set enabled to false. Now, I do want to talk about the handling of phone numbers because it's important to understand where we need to go to edit a user's phone number post decommissioning or removal of the Skype for Business on-prem environment. And really the key to all of this is where was the user enabled for voice prior to their move to Teams? If the user was enabled for voice on premises prior to their move to Teams, that means the MSRTC SIP line attribute was populated in on-premises Active Directory. Well, when that value is populated in on-prem Active Directory, it syncs into Azure Active Directory, and the on-prem line URI becomes the line URI. You can see here in my screenshot, I have an on-prem line URI for this user, which maps to the line URI for this user, and this value of on-prem line URI manually set is false. That indicates that effectively the owner of this line URI is on-premises Active Directory. That means if I completely decommission the on-prem Skype environment, and then this user's phone number changes, if I try to change it in the service with the commandlet that you see here, notice the error that I'm going to get. Cannot update on-prem line URI as the user is a dirsynced on-premises line URI. Ooh, yeah, that's because on-prem AD is effectively authoritative for this user's phone number. That means you need to continue to manage this user's phone number through the on-prem MSRTC SIP line attribute. Now, again, you don't have to have your Skype for Business environment around for this. It's just simply an attribute on the user. You can see here, this is a screenshot from Active Directory users and computers. Just open up the attribute editor. I can scroll to that attribute and edit it as I see fit. But key thing to understand, if the user was enabled for voice prior to this move to Teams, right? Basically, the on-prem line URI was set. You're going to have to continue to manage it from on-premises. Contrast that if the user was not enabled for voice prior to their move to Teams, right? In this example, the MSRTC SIP line attribute was not populated in the on-premises Active Directory. That means that we enabled the user in the service and we used the set CS user commandlet to assign their on-prem line URI. Well, check out what's different here, right? My on-prem line URI is set, which maps to my line URI, as you saw before, but notice what's different. On-prem line URI manually set is true. This means that I manually set this in the service. It wasn't set in on-prem and synced to the service. That's an important distinction because when this on-prem line URI manually set is true, I can modify it the same way that I set it. I can use set CS user, the user's ID, dash on-prem line URI, and I can put in the new value. And I won't get that same error message that you saw on the previous slide telling me that there was a value being synced from the on-premises world. Okay, now we come to the fun part. How do I remove the Skype for Business server environment? Well, first you need to ensure that there's nothing effectively left in the on-prem environment. No more users left in the on-prem world. No more apps or service accounts or anything that's left in the on-premises Skype for Business environment. From there, you can go into Topology Builder and effectively remove the deployment. Right? There's actually an option in Topology Builder that will allow you to remove the deployment. You'll publish that, wait for CMS replication to do its thing, and at that stage, you'll be able to start the removal of the Skype for Business server environment. You'll remove the remaining conference directories using the commandlets that you see in the middle of the slide, and then you'll do a publish CS topology with the -finalize uninstall parameter. That basically is going to publish an empty topology and allow you to remove the rest of the pieces of the puzzle, right? Once we've done that publish CS topology with the finalize uninstall, we can remove the config store location from AD using remove CS configuration store location, and then we can unprep the domain and unprep the forest. Now, you don't have to use the -domain parameters unless you're in a multi-domain environment, right? Just running disable CS80 domain or disable CS80 forest will run it in the current context of the domain that it's being run in. Now you might wonder, should I disable the users before I decommission the Skype for Business server environment? Word of caution, disable CS user will remove all of the Skype for Business attributes from the user accounts in on-premises. That includes clearing out the MSRTC SIP line attribute. Remember, that's a critical attribute if this user was enabled for enterprise voice on premises. And it's an attribute that we still need to use if on-prem Active Directory is actually authoritative for that phone number. So if you run disable CS user, you're going to blank that out. Well, guess what? You run that and it syncs into Azure Active Directory. Poof, we remove the user's line URI in the service for that direct routing configured user. That's not great because you just took the user's phone number away from them. Now, on the plus side, it does lift that restriction for being able to manage the phone number online because now it's no longer set in on-premises Active Directory, so you wouldn't get the error when you try to do a set CS user because it's not being synced anymore, right? You've effectively cleared it out. But you got to correct that. So if you've done a disable CS user, you need to go into this Skype Online PowerShell or Tenant Remote PowerShell, do a set-CS user, the user ID -on-prem line URI, and put their correct phone number in so they get their phone number back. If you forget to do that, bad things are going to happen because now the user doesn't have a phone number assigned to them, and maybe it'll be more productive. Who knows? But it's not a great end user experience for certain. So you need to use this as an inflection point to determine your path forward for number management, right? As I talked about a few slides ago, you can completely decommission the on-prem environment, don't run disable CS user, and just continue managing the line URI attribute through on-prem Active Directory, right? That's totally fine. You can provision brand new users and always set the line URI on-prem and always let it sync into the service and do all of your management of the line URI from on-prem AD. You could do that. Or you could use this as a demarcation point to say, okay, from this point forward, I'm not going to manage it with on-prem AD. I'm going to do it in Azure AD going forward. That basically means anybody prior to that point, you would manage through on-prem AD, and anybody after that point, you would manage through Azure AD. You could then take the approach, if you desire, of maybe a user at a time or a set of users at a time, doing the disable CS user, let it sync, and then do a set CS user to basically transition, if you will, the user management of the line URI from on-premises AD into Azure AD. If you're going to do that, that's cool, but just beware that you've got to sync that up properly so that you don't have the user going for a period of time without an actual phone number, right? I mean, personally for me, I might just leave it alone. If I see the user in online has that on-prem line URI manually set as false, then I know I need to go edit this attribute in on-prem AD. And if it's set to true, well, then I know I can do it in the service. Maybe for me, that's just a safer bet, but your mileage may vary. You're certainly able to do whatever you see fit. So in summary, the key learnings that we had with direct routing, Direct routing allows us to connect our existing phone infrastructure to Microsoft Teams. We do require that you have a certified session border controller, and we do document the configuration for DR in quite a good amount of detail, which you can also experience in our previous trainings that we did on planning, configuring, and managing direct routing. So to summarize our multi-part training with direct routing, in our first lesson, we covered what is direct routing, when to use it, and how to properly plan for direct routing. Our second training covered configuring and managing of direct routing, and our third and final training covered how to migrate to direct routing. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in future training events.